At 4:30 a.m. on the 15th of March 1790 in the town of Deerfield, Massachusetts, a 9-year-old girl named Mercy Snow was shaken awake by her mother. The room was dark. The fire had burned low. The air in the one-room house was thick with wood smoke and the breathing of 5 other children. Mercy got up without speaking. She dressed in the dark. Her feet found the cold floorboards. By 4:45, she had filled the water bucket from the well outside. The handle of the pump was frozen. She had to break the ice with a stone. Her fingers were numb. She did not cry. This was ordinary. By 5:15, Mercy was tending the kitchen fire. She fed it kindling and split logs. Her mother was already mixing cornmeal for breakfast. Mercy's younger brother, age 7, was sent to the barn to milk the cow. The cow was sick. He came back with only a quart. Their father said nothing. He was already sharpening a scythe by the hearth. At 5:45, the family sat for a meal of corn mush and milk. Mercy ate standing. She did not have time to sit. By 6, she was in the garden, pulling weeds from the rows of onions and beans. The ground was still half frozen. The sun had not yet cleared the tree line. Mercy wore no gloves, her hands cracked. At 7:30, her mother called her inside. The younger children needed watching. Mercy carried a toddler on her hip while she churned butter. The rhythmic thump of the churn filled the room. By 9, the butter was done. She then peeled potatoes for the midday meal. Her mother was spinning wool. Mercy was taught to card wool at 6. Now she could spin a simple thread, but today she was needed for other tasks. At 10:30, she was sent to the neighbor's house. The neighbor woman was sick. Mercy delivered a loaf of bread and a jar of pickled beets. She ran. She was told to run. She did not stop to play. By noon, Mercy returned. She helped serve the midday meal. There was salt pork, potatoes, and dried apple tart. Her father ate first. The children ate after. Mercy took her portion to the corner. She had no time to rest. At 1 p.m., she was sent to the field to collect stones. The spring planting was near. The field had to be cleared. She worked with her older sister, age 12. They carried stones in their aprons, dumped them at the edge. By 3, Mercy began to feel dizzy. She ignored it. By 4, she had filled 3 buckets of stones. Her back ached. Her hands were raw. At 5:30, she was called to help with the evening chores. The cow needed milking again. The chickens needed to be shut in. Her father ordered her to fetch water. She dropped the bucket. The cold had made her fingers clumsy. Her father shouted. She retrieved the bucket and filled it. She did not cry. At 6:45, the family ate a supper of leftover porridge and bread. Mercy sat for the first time all day. Then she washed the dishes. Then she knitted stockings by candlelight for 1 hour. At 8 p.m. she was sent to bed. She slept on a straw pallet on the floor. She was too tired to pray. She was 9 years old. This was not an unusual day. This was not a difficult day. This was a standard day for a child in rural New England in the late 18th century. Mercy Snow was not abused, neglected, or exceptional. She was expected to work. From the age of 4 or 5, children in early America were assigned chores. By age 7, most children were given tasks that kept them occupied from dawn until dusk. Play, if it happened at all, was squeezed into margins. A stolen moment between chores, a game of tag while waiting for the bread to rise, a handful of pebbles rolled on the floor after supper. Even then, parents considered idleness a sin. John Locke had written that children should be taught to work early. The Puritans believed that play was the devil's workshop. Benjamin Franklin said, "Sloth, like rust, consumes faster than labor wears." But what children actually did, how they worked, for how long, under what conditions, varied widely across the colonies and the early republic. Geography, family wealth, religion, and regional economy shaped childhood. A 6-year-old on a Chesapeake tobacco plantation did not work the same as a 6-year-old in a Philadelphia merchant's kitchen. An 8-year-old in the coastal fishing villages of Massachusetts did not have the same duties as an 8-year-old in the frontier forests of Kentucky. But across all these places, one rule held: children were economic assets. Their labor was expected. It was not optional. It was not questioned. What happened to the child who did not work? The answer was not kind. In 1768, a Massachusetts court heard the case of a 9-year-old boy named Samuel. He had been bound out as an apprentice to a shoemaker. The shoemaker reported that Samuel was lazy, stubborn, and willful. He beat him. Samuel ran away. The court ordered Samuel returned to the shoemaker. The judge said the boy needed correction. This was not unusual. Children who refused to work could be punished, beaten, or sent to the workhouse. In 1787, a Philadelphia newspaper reported the death of a 12-year-old girl who had been forced to work in a rope walk. She collapsed. The coroner ruled it an accident. The rope walk owner paid a fine. The fine was 20 shillings. The expectation of child labor was rooted in the structure of the early American household. Most families lived on farms. The farm was a self-contained economy. Every hand mattered. A child who did not contribute was a drain on limited resources. Parents believed that work built character. It taught discipline. It prepared children for a life of hardship. The New England Primer used to teach reading included the lines, "In Adam's fall we sinned all. A dog will bite a thief at night. The idle fool is whipped at school." Work was not only practical, it was moral. Idleness was a sin. Play was tolerated only in small doses and only after chores were done. Even then, it was viewed with suspicion. How could this have become normal? To understand, we have to step back to the earliest English settlements. In 1607, Jamestown was founded. The colony nearly collapsed because no one wanted to work. The settlers, mostly men, expected to find gold. They did not expect to plant corn. Children were scarce. The first recorded child born at Jamestown was a girl named Virginia Dare's generation, but she was born at Roanoke. Jamestown's children were few. Within a decade, the colony realized that survival required labor. Everyone worked. Children were no exception. By 1620, the Virginia Company sent orphan children from London to the colony as servants. They worked in fields and kitchens. Some died within a year. In New England, the Pilgrims and Puritans arrived with families. The Mayflower carried 30 children. The youngest was 2. Over that first winter, half the passengers died. The children who survived worked. They gathered firewood, fetched water, tended small livestock. By spring they planted, by summer they harvested. There was no school, there was no playground, there was only survival. The first formal school in Massachusetts, the Boston Latin School, did not open until 1635. Even then, only boys attended. Girls learned to read at home, then were put to work. Education was secondary. Labor came first. By the unsupported the pattern was set. In rural areas, children's work revolved around the seasons. Spring meant planting. Summer meant weeding and harvest. Fall meant preserving food, slaughtering animals, and preparing for winter. Winter meant indoor chores, spinning, weaving, candle making, repairing tools. Children as young as 3 were given simple tasks. They could gather eggs, hold yarn, or carry kindling. By 6, they could weed gardens, feed chickens, or mind younger siblings. By 10, they could chop wood, milk cows, or help with harvest. By 14, they were considered near adults doing full workloads. But work was not limited to farms. In towns and cities, children were apprentices or servants. Starting around age 7 to 9, children were often bound out by their parents to learn a trade. This was not punishment. It was a common pathway into adulthood. The child signed a contract, usually with the consent of a father or a family friend. The master agreed to teach the trade, provide food and lodging, and sometimes give basic schooling. The child agreed to work faithfully, keep secrets, avoid gambling, and not marry. The contract lasted until the child turned 21. In practice, many children were treated harshly. They worked long hours, slept in cold attics, and were beaten for mistakes. The system of indentured servitude and apprenticeship was not always cruel. Some masters treated children well, taught them reading and arithmetic, and set them up for independent work. But the legal structure gave the master almost total authority. A child could be sued for disobedience. A child who ran away could be arrested and returned. A master had the right to correct the child. That meant whipping. There were no child labor laws. There were no mandatory breaks. There were no restrictions on hours. What did this mean for the children themselves? We have some records. Diaries, court documents, letters. One of the most revealing is the diary of a girl named Elizabeth Drinker. She lived in Philadelphia in the late 1700s. She was a Quaker, well off. Her children did not work in the fields, but even in her household the children had duties. They were expected to be quiet, helpful, and industrious. Elizabeth wrote in her diary in 1793 that her 8-year-old son had been sent to a school that lasted from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. with only a half-hour break for lunch. When he came home, he had to practice writing, then help with errands. He was allowed to play on Saturday afternoons for 1 hour. In contrast, children of the poor had no such limit. In 1810, a factory in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, employed children as young as 7. They worked from dawn until 8 p.m. They stood at looms for 14 hours. A report from 1814 noted that children in these mills suffered from curved spines, bad eyesight, and chronic fatigue. One mill owner testified that he preferred orphan children because they were more manageable. He paid them less than $1 a week. They lived in company boarding houses. They were inspected for cleanliness and punctuality. They were fined for lateness. But the most disturbing cases were not in factories. They were in the fields. In the southern colonies, enslaved children worked from the moment they could walk. A child of 4 might carry water to the field hands. A child of 6 might be given a small basket and required to pick cotton. The records of plantations from Virginia to Georgia show that slave children worked alongside adults by age 8. They were not paid. They were not thanked. They were property. The laws of the time defined them as chattel. A slave child could be sold away from parents. The internal slave trade in the early 1800s tore apart families. Children as young as 5 were listed in inventories alongside cattle and hogs. Free black children in the North also worked. They were often apprenticed out but faced discrimination. They were paid less than white children. They were rarely taught a trade that led to independence. By 1820, the first free black communities in cities like New York and Philadelphia had their own schools, but most black children still worked in domestic service or manual labor. How did children respond to all of this? We have fragments. A boy writing in 1769 said, "I hope to be a man soon so I can stop being a boy." A girl in 1783 wrote to her aunt, "I have no time for dolls. Mother says dolls are for babies." A court case in 1742 recorded a 10-year-old servant who set fire to his master's barn. When asked why, he said, "Because I wanted to see the flames, and I hated the work." Another boy ran away 7 times. He was caught each time. The last time the court ordered him to be branded on the palm. The brand was the letter R for runaway. Work defined childhood, but it also shaped adulthood. The skills children learned, farming, sewing, carpentry, cooking, were survival skills. They learned discipline, patience, endurance. Many adults later looked back with pride on their hard childhoods. Others remembered only exhaustion. One woman wrote in her 1850 memoir that she had been raised on a farm and never knew what it was to have an hour to myself until I was 16. She said, "Play was a thing we heard about but never saw." The system did not begin to change until the early 1800s. The first stirrings of the reform movement came from urban doctors and ministers who noticed the toll of factory work on children. In 1800, the Pennsylvania hospital documented cases of children with deformities of the spine caused by long hours sitting at looms. In 1805, the New York Society for the Prevention of Pauperism argued that children should not work more than 10 hours a day. But these were early voices, ignored by many. The first statewide child labor law in the United States was not passed until 1836 in Massachusetts. It required that children under 15 who worked in factories attend school for at least 3 months a year. The law was barely enforced. So what did children's lives look like in early America? They looked like Mercy Snow's day. They looked like the enslaved child in the cotton field. They looked like the apprentice in a shoemaker's shop, beaten for dropping a stitch. They looked like the mill child with curved spine and swollen feet. Work came before play every day. The phrase children should be seen and not heard was not just a saying. It was a rule. It was a system. It was the law. And it was the only world they knew. But we must ask, why did early Americans believe this was right? The answer lies in the values of the time. Resource scarcity, religious doctrine, economic necessity, and family structure all combine to make child labor not just acceptable but expected. Children were not seen as individuals with emotional needs. They were seen as future workers, current helpers, and evidence of moral training. A child who played too much was a child who would grow up lazy. That was a danger to the community. So the work was relentless. The hours were long. The penalty for refusing was punishment. The result was a generation of children who grew up fast or died trying. In the next segment, we will examine specific regions and groups: New England farm families, Southern plantation slave children, the children of the frontier, and the first generation of factory workers. We will look at what they ate, what they wore, what they feared, and what they dreamed of, if they had time to dream. We will trace how the idea of childhood itself began to shift slowly over the span of decades, until the first child labor reformers started asking uncomfortable questions. What happens to a child who works from dawn to dusk? What happens to a soul that never learns to play? But first, let us stay with Mercy Snow. She is 9. She will continue to work. She will marry at 15, have 8 children, and die at 42. Her children will work. It is the world she knows. It is the world she expects, and it will take another 100 years for that world to begin to crack. At 5 a.m. on the first Monday of March 1810, a bell rang in the village of Pawtucket, Rhode Island. It was the signal for the mill children to wake. In the boarding house on Main Street, a 9-year-old boy named Samuel opened his eyes. He had slept on a straw mattress shared with 2 other boys. The room had no fire. It was still dark. The bell meant he had 30 minutes to dress, eat a bowl of porridge, and walk to the mill. At 5:30, the second bell rang. The doors closed. Anyone late was fined half a day's pay. Samuel worked at a spinning frame. His job was to repair broken threads. He stood for 14 hours. He had no stool. At 7 p.m. the final bell rang. He walked back to the boarding house, ate a slice of bread, and slept. He did this 6 days a week. On Sunday, he went to church. There was no play. Samuel's story is not unique. It is recorded in a report written by Dr. William J. Thompson in 18 Wafiv. Thompson was one of the first physicians to study the health of factory children. He documented that Samuel suffered from a curved spine, chronic cough, and swollen ankles. The report noted that Samuel's mother had died when he was 6. His father had indentured him to the mill owner for 7 years. Samuel was not paid in cash. He received room, board, and 2 sets of clothes per year. The contract stated that if Samuel became ill and could not work, he would be sent to the poorhouse. The mill owner bore no responsibility for medical care. What happened to Samuel is not known. The records end, but his case was used by early reform advocates. In 1825, a group of ministers in Providence began collecting testimonies from mill children. They interviewed dozens. One girl named Abigail, age 11, said she had been working at the mill since age 8. She said she had never learned to read. She said she had never seen a book. Another boy, age 13, said he had fallen onto a spinning machine and lost 2 fingers. The mill owner deducted the cost of the bandages from his wages. The boy was then sent home. He had no family. He ended up in a poorhouse. These testimonies were published in a pamphlet called The Cry of the Children. It caused a minor stir. But it did not change the law. The mill owners responded by saying the children were better off than they would be in the streets. They argued that work built character. They pointed out that many children were orphans or from poor families. They said the children were fed and housed. They said the children were grateful. But the testimonies kept coming. In 1830, a survey of 30 mill children in Lowell, Massachusetts, found that none could name the current president. Only 3 could write their names. 15 had never seen a map. 22 had visible deformities from standing all day. The survey was conducted by a school teacher named Sarah Bagley. She later became one of the first female labor organizers in the United States. She wrote that the children were dead in spirit by age 14. She said they had no curiosity, no joy, no hope. How could this have happened? The answer lies in the legal and economic structure of early America. At the time, there were no compulsory education laws. There were no minimum age requirements for factory work. There were no limits on hours. The concept of childhood as a protected period of development did not exist in the way it does today. Children were considered small adults capable of contributing to the family economy. The law reinforced this. A father owned the labor of his children. He could hire them out, apprentice them, or sell their services. If a child refused to work, the father could have them beaten by a constable. The child had no legal recourse. The earliest documented case of a child resisting this system occurred in 1799 in New York City. A 10-year-old indentured servant named Eliza ran away from her master, a baker named John Haynes. She was captured and brought before the mayor's court. The court record shows that Eliza told the judge she had run away because she was forced to sleep in the cellar and was given only bread and water. The judge asked her why she did not simply obey. She said, "Because I am a person, not a dog." The judge ordered her returned to her master. He also ordered that she receive 12 lashes for lying. The record does not say whether she ran away again, but we know that within 5 years she was free. She had turned 21. Her indenture expired. She married a shoemaker. She had children of her own. She never sent them to work in a mill. Eliza's story is a rare exception. Most children accepted their fate. They had no framework for imagining a different life. But the system began to crack in the 183's rows, not from the protests of children, but from the growing unease of urban reformers. These were doctors, ministers, and wealthy women who visited factories and wrote about what they saw. Their reports were circulated in newspapers and pamphlets. They used language that appealed to morality and national pride. They asked, what kind of nation allows its children to be crippled before they can vote? One of the most influential reports came from the Massachusetts state legislature in 1836. A committee was formed to investigate the condition of factory children. The committee interviewed owners, overseers, and children. The testimony was chilling. One overseer said that he preferred children under 12 because they were more docile. Another said that he used a strap on any child who fell asleep at the machine. A 13-year-old girl testified that she worked from 5 a.m. to 7:30 p.m., with 2 breaks of 30 minutes each. She said she had not seen sunlight in 4 months because the mill windows were painted over to prevent distractions. The committee's report was published in 1837. It recommended that no child under 10 should work in a factory. It recommended that children between 10 and 14 should work no more than 10 hours a day. It recommended that factory owners provide some form of schooling. The recommendations were not binding. They were suggestions, but they marked the first official recognition that child labor was a problem worth addressing. The year 1836 also brought the first statewide child labor law in the United States, passed in Massachusetts. It required that children under 15 who worked in factories attend school for at least 3 months a year. The law was weak. It had no enforcement mechanism. Factory owners simply ignored it, but it set a precedent. Other states began to consider similar laws. In 1842, Connecticut passed a law limiting the workday of children under 14 to 10 hours. In 1844, Rhode Island followed. In 1848, Pennsylvania passed a law banning children under 12 from working in factories, but each law had loopholes. Parents could sign waivers. Children could be listed as apprentices. Enforcement was almost non-existent. The turning point came not from laws but from a single disaster. On the morning of March 13, 1850, a fire broke out in a textile mill in Fall River, Massachusetts. The mill employed over 200 children. The doors were locked from the outside to prevent theft. The windows were barred. When the fire started in the basement, the children on the 3rd floor had no way out. 58 children died. The youngest was 6. The oldest was 15. The coroner's inquest found that the mill owner had been warned about the locked doors. He had ignored the warnings. He was charged with manslaughter but acquitted. The jury said the children's deaths were an accident. The Fall River fire was covered in newspapers across the country. It sparked public outrage. Mothers of the dead children formed a group called the Fall River Female Reform Society. They petitioned the state legislature for stricter fire codes and child labor limits. They testified before committees. They held meetings. They were dismissed by factory owners as hysterical women, but they persisted. In 1852, Massachusetts passed a law requiring fire drills in factories. In 1853, it passed a law requiring that children under 12 work no more than 10 hours a day. Enforcement remained weak, but the principle was established. What did children themselves think? We have a few surviving letters and diaries. One was written by a 12-year-old named Mary in 1845. She worked in a Lowell mill. She wrote to her sister, "I am so tired, my feet ache. My back aches. I cannot write much because my eyes hurt from the dust. I dream of the farm. I dream of the creek behind our old house. But when I wake, I hear the bell. I must go." Another child, a boy named James, wrote in 1848, "I have been beaten 3 times this month, once for sneezing, once for looking out the window, once for drinking water without permission. I am not allowed to drink water during work hours. The overseer says it wastes time." These children had no legal protection, but they had resilience. Some found small moments of defiance. A girl named Patience, age 13, was caught singing while she worked. The overseer told her to stop. She continued. He struck her. She stopped singing but began humming. He sent her home for the day. She later wrote that it was the best day of her life because she got to sit in the sun. The system also varied greatly by region. In the North, factory work dominated. In the South, enslaved children worked the fields. But there was a third group, children on the frontier. These children lived on isolated farms in the Ohio Valley, the Great Lakes region, and the Mississippi River basin. They did not have factories. They had no mills. They worked from dawn to dusk clearing land, planting crops, tending livestock, and cooking. Their labor was essential for survival. One frontier child later wrote that she remembered only 2 things from childhood: work and fear. The fear was of wolves, bears, Native American raids, and disease. The work was endless. A diary from a 13-year-old girl in Indiana in 1823 records a typical day. Rose at 4, fed the chickens, milked 2 cows, churned butter. Ate breakfast, walked 2 miles to fetch water, helped mother wash clothes, hung them, picked beans, shelled peas, cooked dinner, washed dishes, sewed a torn shirt, fed the pigs, milked again, cooked supper, ate, washed dishes, mended socks, went to bed at 9. I am very tired. I did not have time to look at the flowers. The flowers. There was no time for flowers, no time for play, no time for childhood in any recognizable sense. And yet these children grew up. They became the adults who settled the West, built the factories, and raised the next generation. They did not know that their experience was unusual. They did not know that in other parts of the world, children were beginning to be protected. They only knew the bell, the whip, the field, the loom. As the 19th century progressed, the reform movement gained momentum. In 1855, the first children's hospital in the United States opened in Philadelphia. It was founded by a doctor who had examined factory children and found that many had conditions that could be cured with rest, sunlight, and good food. He wrote, "These children are not naturally sick. They are made sick by work." In 1860, the first compulsory education law in the United States was passed in Massachusetts. It required that all children between 8 and 14 attend school for at least 12 weeks a year. The law was not fully enforced for decades, but it planted a seed. The Civil War interrupted the reform movement, but after the war, the pace quickened. In 1870, the census recorded over 1 million children under age 16 working for wages. The number shocked the nation. In 1874, the American Social Science Association published a report titled The Employment of Children. It listed the occupations in which children worked: factories, mines, farms, street trades, domestic service, and apprenticeships. It documented cases of children working in coal mines as young as 7, crawling through tunnels too narrow for adults. It documented cases of children working in glass factories, handling molten glass, burning their hands. It documented cases of children working as newsboys, sleeping on the streets, addicted to alcohol. The children of early America did not choose their lives. They were born into a system that required their labor. They were told that work was good for them. They were told that play was a waste. They were told that they were lucky to have a master. They were told that obedience was the highest virtue. The few who questioned were punished. The many who endured survived, but at a cost. Their bodies were shaped by the work. Their minds were shaped by the absence of choice. One of the most poignant records comes from a girl named Rebecca, who in 1852, at age 9, was sent to work as a domestic servant in a wealthy home in Boston. She wrote in a letter, "They have a piano. I have never heard music before. I listened at the door. The lady of the house caught me. She said I was lazy. She made me scrub the floor with a brush. But I still remember the music. It was like water. I will never forget it." Rebecca's letter was preserved by a reformer who collected the stories of child workers. It ends, "I hope one day to have a piano of my own, or at least to hear music again, but I think I will be too old by then." Too old by then. She was 9. On the morning of September 6, 1869, a fire broke out in the Avondale Colliery in Plymouth, Pennsylvania. The mine employed over 100 children, most of them boys between the ages of 8 and 14. They worked as breaker boys, picking slate and rock from coal, or as door tenders, opening and closing ventilation doors deep underground. At exactly 11 a.m., a spark from a steam hoist ignited the wooden casing around the mine shaft. The fire spread quickly, consuming the only ladder and the only means of escape. The mine had no second exit. It had no emergency plan. It had no fire drills. The children underground did not know about the fire until smoke filled the tunnels. By then, the shaft was a chimney. The ventilation system had been designed to pull air upward. When the fire started at the top, the air reversed direction. The smoke was pulled down into the mine. The children had no masks, no alarms, no training. They panicked. Some ran deeper into the tunnels, hoping to find another way out. There was none. Others collapsed from smoke inhalation within minutes. Above ground, rescuers arrived within the hour, but the shaft was burning. They could not descend until the fire was contained. They poured water down the shaft, but the coal dust and wooden supports kept burning. By late afternoon, the fire had burned itself out. Rescuers finally entered. They found bodies near the base of the shaft, piled in a heap. The youngest was 7. The oldest was 17. In total, 110 people died, including 58 children. The Avondale disaster was the deadliest mine accident in American history at that time. It was also the first to draw national attention to the use of child labor in mining. Newspapers across the country ran illustrations of the breaker boys, their small bodies crushed by coal cars, their lungs blackened by dust. The coroner's inquest placed blame on the mine owner, who had failed to install a second exit despite repeated warnings from the state inspector. The owner was charged with manslaughter but, like the mill owner in Fall River, was acquitted. The jury decided the disaster was an accident that could not have been foreseen, but it had been foreseen. The state inspector had filed a report 2 years earlier, warning that the Avondale mine had no emergency escape. The report had been ignored. After the disaster, the Pennsylvania legislature passed the first mine safety law in the United States. It required all mines to have a second means of egress, emergency ventilation, and regular inspections. It also, for the first time, established a minimum age for mine workers, 12 years old. The law was weak, enforcement was sparse, but the principle was now on paper. The Avondale disaster changed the conversation about child labor. Until then, the focus had been on factories and mills. Mines were seen as dangerous but necessary. Children had been working in mines since the early days of the Industrial Revolution. In the 1840s, a British observer named Anthony Ashley Cooper had documented the horrors of child mine labor in England. His reports led to the Mines and Collieries Act of 1842, which banned women and girls from working underground in Britain and raised the minimum age to 10. In America, similar reforms lagged by decades. The Avondale disaster pushed the issue into the public conscience. If children could die in such a preventable way, how many other dangers were being ignored? The answer was many. In the decades following Avondale, investigators, social workers, and journalists began to document the full scope of child labor in America. They found children working in textile mills, factories, canneries, and glassworks. They found children working on farms, in fisheries, and on city streets. They found children employed in tenement workshops, sewing clothing, rolling cigars, and assembling artificial flowers. The work was often dangerous. In the glassworks, children as young as 6 were required to carry hot glass on long iron rods. Their hands were burned, their lungs scarred by fumes. In the cigar factories, children rolled tobacco in dim rooms, breathing in nicotine dust, developing respiratory diseases. In the canneries, children worked 14-hour shifts, standing in water, their hands cut by shell edges. The children themselves became the subject of reform. In 1874, the American Social Science Association published its landmark study, The Employment of Children. The study estimated that over 1 million children under 16 were working for wages in the United States. It found that most were not orphans or delinquents. They were children of poor families, often the sole breadwinners after a parent had died or become ill. The study concluded that child labor was not a moral failing but an economic necessity. Yet it also argued that the necessity was created by a system that paid adults too little to support their families. The solution was not to ban child labor outright, but to regulate hours, improve conditions, and provide education. This approach gained traction in the 1880s. In 1881, the first statewide child labor law in the modern sense was passed in New York. It prohibited the employment of children under 13 in factories and set a maximum workday of 8 hours for children under 16. The law was based on a model drafted by the New York State Charities Aid Association. It required employers to keep records of the ages of their workers and to provide certificates issued by school officials. The law was a step forward, but it had loopholes. Children could work in street trades like newsboys, messengers, and bootblacks without any restrictions. They could work in agriculture, domestic service, and on family farms. And enforcement remained weak. In the first year of the law, only a handful of factory inspections were conducted. Most violations went unnoticed. In 1883, the American Federation of Labor adopted a resolution calling for the total abolition of child labor for children under 14. The resolution was led by Samuel Gompers, who had himself worked as a child in a cigar factory. He wrote, "The child who works is the child who cannot learn. The child who cannot learn grows into an adult who cannot compete. The cycle of poverty continues." The Federation's position was radical for its time. Many union members worried that banning child labor would increase the cost of goods and reduce the number of jobs for adults. But over the next 2 decades, the tide of public opinion began to shift. In 1889, the Illinois legislature passed a law requiring children to attend school until age 14, with few exceptions. The law was a direct response to the 1886 Haymarket Affair, which had exposed the poverty and exploitation of working-class children in Chicago. The law was challenged in court by factory owners, but the Illinois Supreme Court upheld it, ruling that the state had a compelling interest in the education of its future citizens. In 1890, the United States Census showed that over 1.5 million children between 10 and 15 were working. The number was alarming, but it represented a decline from previous decades. The decline was attributed to a combination of state laws, school attendance requirements, and a growing middle-class ideal that childhood should be a time of education and play rather than labor. But the decline was uneven. In the South, child labor remained widespread in textile mills. In the West, children worked on farms and in mines. In the Northeast, children worked in factories and tenements. One of the most effective reformers of the era was a young photographer named Lewis Hine. In 1908, he was hired by the National Child Labor Committee to document children working in factories, mines, and fields across the country. Hine's photographs were stark, clear, and devastating. They showed a 9-year-old girl working at a loom, her feet unable to reach the pedals. They showed an 11-year-old boy carrying coal baskets on his back, his spine bent. They showed children sleeping on piles of clothing in sweatshops, their faces gaunt. Hines' images were published in newspapers and magazines. They reached millions of Americans. They made the abstract issue of child labor real. In 1912, the U.S. Congress established the Children's Bureau, the first federal agency dedicated to child welfare. The Bureau was tasked with investigating and reporting on child labor, infant mortality, and other issues affecting children. Its first chief was Julia Lathrop, a social worker who had earlier founded the Juvenile Court of Cook County. She wrote, "The child is not the property of the parent or the employer. The child belongs to the future." But the battle was far from over. In 1916, Congress passed the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act, which prohibited the interstate shipment of goods produced by children under 14 or by children under 16 who worked more than 8 hours a day. The law was challenged by a textile mill owner named Roland Dagenhart, who argued that it violated the Commerce Clause and the rights of states to regulate labor. The case reached the Supreme Court in 1908. In a 5-4 decision, the court struck down the law, ruling that Congress could not use its commerce power to regulate the conditions of labor. The decision was a blow to reformers. They had believed that the federal government could finally act where states had failed. Instead, the court sent the issue back to the states. For the next 2 decades, child labor remained a patchwork of state laws. Some states had strong protections, others had none. In the 1920s and 1930s, the Great Depression reduced the economic necessity of child labor. Many adults were out of work, and employers replaced them with children at lower wages. But the public reaction was different. During the Depression, child labor was seen as taking jobs away from adults. Reformers used this argument to push for stronger laws. In 1937, the Supreme Court reversed its earlier position in NLRB v. Jones and Laughlin Steel Corp., effectively giving the federal government more power to regulate commerce. In 1938, Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, which set a minimum wage and a maximum workweek for many workers. It also banned the employment of children under 16 in most occupations and under 18 in hazardous work. The law was signed by President Franklin Roosevelt in June 1938. It took effect on October 24, 1938. On that day, thousands of children were sent home from factories across the country. The law did not end child labor immediately. It had exemptions for agriculture, street trades, and family businesses. It took decades of additional legislation to close many of those loopholes. But the FLSA was a turning point. For the first time, the federal government had declared that children had a right to be free from exploitative work. The law was based on the same logic that had been emerging since the Fall River fire of 1850, that children are not miniature adults, that their labor has a cost, and that society has a responsibility to protect them. What children's lives were like in early America was defined by work before play. They grew up fast, or they did not grow up at all. They worked in fields, factories, mines, and homes. They lost fingers, lungs, and future in exchange for survival. The reform movement that began in the wake of disasters like the Fall River fire and the Avondale mine tragedy slowly built a legal framework that recognized childhood as a distinct stage of life. It took a century of laws, protests, photographs, and reports. It took the deaths of thousands of children. But in the end, the principle that guided the reformers was simple. A child should not have to work until the body breaks and the mind forgets how to dream. The last great battle against child labor in the United States came in the 1940s, when Congress attempted to amend the Constitution with a child labor amendment. It failed to gain ratification. But by then, the FLSA was in place, and the numbers of working children had plummeted. Today, child labor in the United States is rare, and when discovered, investigated by both federal and state authorities. But the history of how children lived in early America remains a reminder of how recent these protections are, and how fragile they can be. At 7:15 a.m. on the 16th of March 1860, a five-story brick building in Lawrence, Massachusetts, suddenly collapsed. The Pemberton Mill was full of workers. Most were young women, but a significant number were children, some as young as 10. The building had been constructed hastily, with cheap materials. The iron columns that supported the floors were brittle. Minutes before the collapse, workers had reported shaking. Supervisors ignored the warnings. When the structure gave way, the floors pancaked one after another. Hundreds were trapped under tons of brick and machinery. Rescuers worked through the night. Gas lamps were brought in. Eventually, a fire started in the rubble. It burned for hours. The final death toll was 88, with dozens more injured. Many of the dead were children. What happened in Lawrence was not an isolated tragedy. The Pemberton Mill collapse was a direct consequence of a system that placed profit over safety. The mill had been built to maximize production. The owners had used substandard materials to save money. The workers, including children, had no say in their working conditions. They had no union. They had no inspectors. The state of Massachusetts had passed a law in 1842 limiting children under 12 to 10 hours of work per day, but enforcement was virtually non-existent. The Pemberton Mill employed children in violation of that law. No one checked. In the aftermath, investigators found that the iron columns were made from recycled scrap metal that contained impurities. The columns had been tested, but only by loading them with sandbags. The test failed to simulate the vibration of machinery. The building was a death trap long before it fell. The owners were not held criminally liable. They claimed the collapse was an act of God. The public was outraged, but the legal system offered no remedy. The children who died were quickly forgotten, buried in unmarked graves. The Pemberton Mill disaster was one of many. In the decades that followed, similar tragedies occurred across the country. In 1872, the Great Boston Fire destroyed a factory that employed children. In 1882, the Ameskeag Mill in Manchester, New Hampshire, suffered a series of accidents that killed several boys. In 1900, a boiler explosion at a textile mill in Saltsburg, Pennsylvania, killed 6 children. Each disaster prompted brief outrage, then reform stalled. The pattern repeated. How could this have happened? The answer lies in the economics of early industrial America. Children were cheap labor. They did not demand higher wages. They did not form unions. They were small enough to fit into tight spaces in mines and mills. They could be trained quickly and dismissed without cost. For factory owners, children were an asset. For families, children were a necessity. A farm family that moved to the city could not survive on the father's wages alone. Every child who worked added to the household income. The choice was not between work and play. It was between work and hunger. By the 1890s, the child labor reform movement had gained momentum. The National Child Labor Committee was founded in 1904. Its members included social workers, clergy, and educators. They lobbied for state laws and federal action. But the textile industry fought back. In the South, mill owners argued that child labor was a matter of state rights and personal freedom. They claimed that working children were learning discipline and avoiding idleness. They published pamphlets showing smiling children at looms. The reality was different. Lewis Hine, the photographer hired by the NCLC, captured that reality. His images from 1908 to 1912 are among the most powerful documents of the era. One photograph shows a girl named Flora, age 12, working at a spinning frame in a North Carolina mill. Her eyes are tired. Her hands are raw. She has been working since she was 9. Another shows a boy named Vance, age 11, carrying a cart of coal in a West Virginia mine. His face is blackened. His shoulders are hunched. Hine wrote captions that included the child's name, age, and working conditions. He often had to sneak into factories, posing as a fire inspector or a Bible salesman. His work helped change public opinion. In 1916, Congress passed the Keating-Owen Act. The Supreme Court struck it down in 1908. In 1919, Congress passed a second law, this time using the tax power. The court struck that down too in 1912. The reformers were frustrated. They tried a constitutional amendment in 1912. It passed Congress but was ratified by only 28 states. The required 36 states were never reached. The amendment remains technically pending today. The turning point came during the Great Depression. Unemployment soared. Adults were desperate for work. Children who worked were seen as taking jobs from breadwinners. The National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933 included provisions against child labor, but the act was declared unconstitutional in 1935. Finally, in 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act was signed into law. It banned the employment of children under 16 in manufacturing and mining. It set a minimum wage and a maximum work week. It took effect on October 24, 1938. But the law was not a complete victory. It exempted agriculture, street trades, and domestic service. In 1939, over 100,000 children under 16 still worked in agriculture. Many were migrant workers, following the harvests from Florida to California. Their families lived in tents and shacks. They had no access to schools. Their children worked from dawn until dusk, picking cotton, sugar beets, and vegetables. The conditions were brutal. The pay was pennies per hour. In 1941, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the FLSA in United States v. Darby. The decision confirmed that Congress had the power to regulate labor conditions under the Commerce Clause. The law was applied more aggressively during World War II, when labor shortages led to increased hiring of teenagers. But the agricultural exemptions remained. In 1947, a Senate subcommittee held hearings on child labor in agriculture. Witnesses described children as young as 5 working in fields. One doctor testified that migrant children suffered from malnutrition, hookworm, and chronic exhaustion. The committee recommended extending FLSA protections to farm workers. The recommendation was ignored. In the 1950s, the number of children working in industry dropped significantly. But in agriculture, the numbers stayed high. A 1955 survey estimated that 450,000 children under 16 worked on farms, many of them with their parents. The Fair Labor Standards Act was amended in 1966 to raise the minimum age for farm work to 16 during school hours, but it still allowed children to work outside school hours at any age. The loophole was enormous. One of the most famous exposés of this era was Edward R. Murrow's 1960 documentary, Harvest of Shame. It showed migrant families living in poverty, their children working in the fields. Murrow's closing words were, "We are not going to do anything about it." And for a long time he was right. The 1970 saw some progress. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration was created in 1970. The FLSA was amended in 1974 to cover more farm workers, but children under 12 could still work with parental consent on small farms. The pattern persisted. In the 1990s, new reports emerged of children working in sweatshops in the United States. A 1995 investigation in El Monte, California, discovered a garment factory where Thai immigrants, including children, were held as virtual slaves. The conditions recalled the tenement houses of the 1850s. In 1999, the U.S. Department of Labor found that over 10,000 children were working illegally in the United States, many in agriculture and street trades. The 21st century brought new challenges. Children working in fast food restaurants, grocery stores, and delivery services sometimes face unsafe conditions. In 2017, a 15-year-old worker died in a meat processing plant in Kansas. In 2020, a 14-year-old was injured in a factory in Ohio. The Fair Labor Standards Act has been updated, but the enforcement has not kept pace with the complexity of the modern economy. The Department of Labor employs only about 1,000 investigators for over 10 million workplaces. many violations go undetected. What children's lives were like in early America is not just a historical question. It is a living one. The laws that were built after disasters like the Pemberton Mill collapse, the Fall River fire, and the Avondale mine tragedy are still in effect, but they are only as strong as the will to enforce them. The children who worked in the 19th century are long gone. Their stories are preserved in court records, census data, and the photographs of Lewis Hine. But the conditions that drove them into the factories, mines, and fields have not disappeared. Poverty, lack of education, and broken immigration systems continue to push children into work. The fight for a childhood that includes play, education, and safety is never truly over. At 6:45 a.m. on August 2, 1995, a caravan of federal agents moved through the streets of El Monte, California. The target was a two-story stucco building on a quiet residential block. The building was surrounded by a 10-foot concrete wall topped with razor wire. The windows were covered with iron bars. The doors were steel. It looked more like a prison than a factory. The agents from the Immigration and Naturalization Service had received a tip from a man who had escaped the previous week. He described conditions that sounded like a nightmare. The agents assembled a search warrant and prepared for entry. At 7:12, they breached the front gate. Inside, they found 71 Thai workers, including children as young as 12. The workers were seated at sewing machines, stitching garments for major American clothing brands. The room was windowless, lit by fluorescent tubes and filled with lint and dust. The workers had been living in the same building for years. They slept in cramped rooms on bunks stacked 3 high. They ate 2 meals a day of rice and vegetables. They worked from 6 in the morning until midnight, 7 days a week. The doors were locked from the outside. They were not allowed to leave. If they complained, they were beaten. If they tried to escape, they were threatened with deportation or harm to their families in Thailand. The agents found children among them. One girl was 12. Another was 13. They had been brought to the United States by traffickers who promised education and opportunity. Instead, they were enslaved in a garment factory. The building had no fire escapes, no emergency exits, and no ventilation. The conditions recalled the tenement sweatshops of the 1910s, but this was 1995 in a suburb of Los Angeles. How could this have happened? The answer lies in the structure of the garment industry. By the 1990s, most clothing production had been outsourced to subcontractors. Large brands contracted with dozens of small sewing shops. The subcontractors competed for the lowest bid. To keep costs down, they employed undocumented workers, often trafficked from Southeast Asia. They paid wages below minimum wage, if they paid at all. They ignored safety laws and labor laws because they knew enforcement was weak. The Department of Labor had fewer than 1,000 inspectors for the entire country. The Los Angeles Garment District had thousands of sewing shops. Many were unregistered. Many operated behind closed doors. The El Monte case became a national scandal. The workers were freed. The owners were arrested and convicted on federal charges of involuntary servitude. The brands that contracted with the factory claimed they did not know. But investigators found documents showing that the factory had been audited by a major brand months before the raid. The auditor had not seen the workers. The auditor had not entered the living quarters. The system of self-regulation had failed. After the raid, the Department of Labor launched a new initiative against sweatshops. The Fair Labor Standards Act was amended in 1996 to include stronger penalties for child labor violations. But the enforcement did not keep pace. The number of inspectors did not increase. The garment industry continued to rely on subcontractors. By 2000, similar sweatshops were found in New York, Texas, and American Samoa. Each time the pattern repeated: a raid, an outcry, a promise of reform, then silence. Meanwhile, another sector of child labor remained even more hidden: agriculture. On a June morning in 2008, a 12-year-old girl named Maria was working in a tomato field in Immokalee, Florida. She had arrived with her family at 5:30 a.m. The sun was already hot. She was given a bucket and told to pick tomatoes. The plants were low, so she had to bend over for hours. She wore no gloves, no hat, no sunscreen. The water cooler was at the edge of the field, a 15-minute walk each way. She did not drink because she could not afford the time. Her pay was based on the number of buckets she filled. By noon, she had filled 16 buckets. She earned about $12. At 2 p.m., she collapsed from heat exhaustion. A supervisor told her to rest in the shade for 10 minutes, then get back to work. Maria was not alone. In 2008, the nonprofit group Human Rights Watch estimated that over 400,000 children under 16 worked in U.S. agriculture. Most were from migrant families. Most were not enrolled in school. They worked alongside their parents in fields across the country. The Fair Labor Standards Act allowed this. The law permitted children of any age to work on small farms with parental consent. For larger farms, the minimum age was 12 during school hours, but only if the farm was exempt from the minimum wage law. Children as young as 10 could work outside school hours. The law had not been meaningfully updated since 1974. The agricultural exemption remained a gaping loophole. In 2010, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers launched a consumer campaign called the Fair Food Program. It forced major fast food chains to agree to pay a penny more per pound of tomatoes and to enforce labor standards on their suppliers. The program included independent monitoring and a complaint hotline. By 2015, it had eliminated child labor in the Florida tomato fields that participated. But the program covered only about 90% of the Florida tomato industry. Other crops and other states had no such program. In August 2018, an undercover investigator from the nonprofit group Farmworker Justice observed a group of children in a strawberry field in New York State. The children were ages 6 to 12. They were picking berries for a large supermarket chain's private label. They worked from 6 in the morning until 6 in the evening with a 30-minute lunch break. They were not paid directly. Their parents were paid piece rates, and the children's work contributed to the family's earnings. The children did not wear protective gear. The fields had been sprayed with pesticides the day before. The investigator documented the scene with photographs and notes. The Department of Labor was notified. An investigation was opened, but it took 2 years to resolve. The employer was fined $8,000. The children were not removed from the fields because the law allowed them to work there. In 2019, the Department of Labor under the Trump administration proposed a rule that would have weakened child labor protections in agriculture, allowing children as young as 12 to work longer hours in hazardous conditions. The rule was withdrawn after public outcry. But the existing protections remained minimal. In 2021, the Biden administration announced new regulations to strengthen enforcement, but they have not been finalized. The loophole persists. What happened in El Monte and Immokalee and New York is not an anomaly. It is the continuation of a pattern that began in the 19th century. The forces that drove children into factories, mines, and fields have not disappeared. They have adapted. The factories moved overseas, but the fields remained. The mines closed, but the sweatshops opened. The laws were passed, but the exemptions were written by the same industries that benefited from child labor. In 2022, a series of investigations by the Associated Press and the New York Times revealed that children were still working illegally in meatpacking plants, slaughterhouses, and automotive parts factories across the United States. The children were as young as 13. They worked overnight shifts. They operated heavy machinery. They were hired by subcontractors who paid them cash and did not check their ages. The Department of Labor fined the companies, but the fines were small. One company paid a fine of $15,000 for employing 14 children. The cost of labor was cheaper than the fines. The economics had not changed. In October 2022, the Department of Labor issued a report on child labor violations. It found that the number of children working illegally had increased by 69% since 2009. The report cited a shortage of inspectors, a reliance on subcontractors, and a weak penalty structure. The average fine for a child labor violation was about $2,000. For a company that saved tens of thousands by hiring children, that was a cost of doing business. The story of children's lives in early America is not a closed chapter. It is an ongoing struggle. The photographs of Lewis Hine from 1908 still have their counterparts in 2003. The children are different. The settings are different, but the reasons are the same. Poverty drives families. Profit drives employers. And the law, even when it exists, is enforced inconsistently or not at all. In December 2023, a federal judge approved a consent decree requiring a poultry plant in Alabama to stop hiring underage workers. The plant had employed children as young as 14 to process chicken. The children had worked with dangerous equipment, including saws and scalders. One 14-year-old had lost a finger. The company agreed to pay a fine of $200,000 and to hire an outside monitor. The parents of the children were not charged. The children themselves were sent back to school, but their families lost income. The cycle continued. What children's lives were like in early America is not just a question of the past, it is a question of the present. The systems that failed them, the lack of education, the desperation of poverty, the willingness of employers to exploit, the weakness of enforcement are still in place. The fight for a childhood that includes play, education, and safety is a fight that remains unfinished. The evidence is not in archives. It is in the fields, the factories, and the warehouses that still employ children today. The clock has not stopped. It is still ticking. On the morning of January 16, 2024, a federal inspection team arrived at a metal recycling facility in Toledo, Ohio. They were from the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division. The facility was operated by a company called Midwest Metal Recovery, a supplier to several major automotive manufacturers. The inspection was not random. It had been triggered by a complaint filed the previous month by a former employee. The complaint alleged that the company employed minors in dangerous roles. At 8:13 a.m., the inspectors entered the plant floor. The air smelled of burnt copper and hydraulic fluid. Conveyor belts moved scrap metal through shredders and sorting lines. The noise was deafening. The inspectors fanned out. They asked for employee rosters and time cards. They asked to see identification documents. At 8:47, an inspector noticed a boy standing near a baler that compressed shredded metal into cubes. The boy looked young. The inspector asked his age. The boy said 14. The inspector asked if he operated the baler. The boy said yes. The inspector took a photo. At 9:02, another inspector found a girl of about 13 working a sorting line, pulling copper wire from a moving belt. She wore no gloves. Her hands were cut and stained. At 9:15, the plant manager was informed of the inspection and asked to produce records. He said the children were part of a work-study program with a local high school. He could not produce any paperwork for that program. By 10:30, the inspectors had documented 8 minors on the floor. Ages ranged from 13 to 15. All were working during school hours. None had filed the required parental consent forms. The company was in violation of the Fair Labor Standards Act as well as state child labor laws. The plant was shut down temporarily. The children were sent home. The company was fined $120,000. The fine was announced in a press release on February 5, 2024. The Department of Labor called it a victory. The company said it would reform its hiring practices. But within 3 months, the same facility was back in operation, and the same subcontractor that had supplied the children was still in business. The inspectors had not checked the subcontractor's records. What happened in Toledo was not isolated. It was part of a larger wave of child labor violations that had been growing since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic had disrupted supply chains and created labor shortages. Employers desperate for workers turned to subcontractors who did not ask questions. The children, many from immigrant families, were easy to recruit. They needed money. Their parents needed money. The schools were closed or remote. There was no one to notice. In 2023, the Department of Labor reported that child labor violations had increased almost 70% over 5 years. But those numbers only captured the cases that were caught. The true figure was likely much higher. Between 2021 and 2023, high-profile cases had surfaced in meatpacking plants, automotive parts factories, and construction sites. Children as young as 13 were found working overnight shifts in slaughterhouses in Tennessee and Arkansas. They were cleaning saws and splitters with hoses and chemicals. They were paid under the table. When the Department of Labor investigated, the companies claimed they had been misled by contractors. The fines were modest, sometimes as low as $15,000. The companies could afford them. The contractors simply dissolved and reopened under new names. In March 2024, a journalist from the Associated Press spent 2 weeks interviewing families in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. She found that children as young as 10 were crossing the border alone and then being sent to work in farms and factories in the Midwest. The children were not runaways. They were sent by their families, who had been promised that their children would be safe and would go to school. Instead, they were placed in low-wage jobs that often violated labor laws. The children were afraid to speak up. They feared deportation. They feared retaliation. They sent money home to their families, who did not know the conditions they were working in. The legal framework that allowed this had roots in early America. The same exemptions written into the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938, exemptions for agriculture, for family farms, for small businesses, still operated. The agricultural exemption had been expanded in 1974 to allow children as young as 10 to work outside school hours. It had not been updated since. The law also exempted children working for their parents, a provision intended to protect family farms, but now used by subcontractors who employed entire families under a single contract. The parents were listed as employees. The children were not listed at all. The subcontractor paid the parent a lump sum, and the parent paid the children. In the eyes of the law, the children were not employed by the subcontractor. They were just helping their parents. This loophole was exposed in July 2024 when a federal judge in Colorado ruled in a case involving a mushroom farm. The farm had employed children as young as 9. The children had worked 12-hour shifts in damp, dark sheds. They had suffered respiratory problems and skin infections. Their parents were paid piece rates. The farm argued that the children were not employees because they were helping their parents. The judge rejected that argument, but the ruling applied only to that farm. The loophole remained for the rest of the industry. In September 2024, the Department of Labor proposed new regulations that would close some of these loopholes. The regulations would require subcontractors to verify the age of all workers and to maintain records of parental consent. They would raise penalties for violations. They would increase the number of inspectors. But the proposed regulations faced immediate opposition from industry groups. The American Farm Bureau Federation and the National Association of Manufacturers argued that the regulations would hurt small businesses and disrupt supply chains. The comment period was extended. The regulations had not been finalized as of late 2024. By October 2024, a series of congressional hearings had been held. Lawmakers from both parties expressed outrage at the scope of child labor violations, but no new legislation was passed. The House and Senate could not agree on an enforcement budget. The Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division had fewer inspectors now than it did in 2000. There were about 700 inspectors for over 11 million workplaces. At the current rate, each workplace would be inspected once every 150 years. The children did not wait. In November 2024, a 16-year-old boy named Carlos was working at a meatpacking plant in Nebraska. He had been hired 2 weeks earlier by a temp agency that did not check his age. He worked on the kill floor, a dangerous area where animals were stunned, then bled out. The floor was slick with blood. The knives were sharp. On his 11th day, Carlos slipped and his arm was caught in a conveyor that carried carcasses. The machine was not stopped in time. His left arm was crushed from the elbow down. He was taken to a hospital. The company reported the injury as a workplace accident. The temp agency reported nothing. The Department of Labor was not notified because the injury did not involve a fatality or an amputation. The company was not fined. Carlos was fired the following week. He was told he could not work with one arm. The story of children's lives in early America has always been about the cost of labor. In the textile mills of 1830, a child could be hired for a fraction of an adult's wage. In the coal mines of 1900, a boy could be sent into narrow tunnels for pennies a ton. In the garment sweatshops of 1995, an immigrant teenager could be locked in a room sewing for 16 hours a day. In the meatpacking plants of 2024, a 14-year-old could stand at a conveyor belt, cutting and sorting for $12 an hour cash. The faces changed. The technology changed. The laws changed on paper, but the fundamental equation never changed. Employers needed cheap labor, and children could provide it. The cost was borne not just by the children but by the society that allowed it. In December 2024, the International Labor Organization released a global report on child labor. It estimated that 160 million children worldwide were engaged in child labor, 63 million of them in hazardous work. The United States was not among the countries with the highest rates, but it was not immune. The report noted that the number of children working in food and agriculture in the U.S. had increased by 9% between 2020 and 2024. The largest increases were in the vegetable and fruit sectors. The children were mostly Latino, mostly from migrant families, mostly invisible. The question that remains is not whether children work in America. It is whether the country will do anything about it. The pattern of reform followed by complacency has repeated itself for over 2 centuries. Each new scandal produces a moment of outrage, a raid, a press conference, a promise. Then the outrage fades. The inspectors are not hired. The laws are not enforced. The children return. In January 2025, the Department of Labor announced a new initiative called Operation Safeguard. It promised to double the number of child labor investigations in the coming year. It promised to partner with state agencies and nonprofit groups. It promised to use data analytics to identify high-risk industries. The announcement was met with cautious optimism. But advocates noted that similar initiatives had been announced in 1996, in 2008, in 2018, and in 2012. Each had produced a short-term spike in enforcement, followed by a return to baseline. The problem was not a lack of initiatives. It was a lack of sustained commitment. The system that allows children to work illegally is not a system of accident. It is a system of design. The exemptions were written deliberately. The penalties were kept low deliberately. The inspectors were underfunded deliberately. The result is an economy that benefits from the labor of children without admitting it. At 7:34 a.m. on a cool morning in February 2025, a van pulled up to a strawberry farm in Ventura County, California. Inside were 6 children, ages 8 to 12. They had been driven from a labor camp 2 hours away. They were carrying small plastic baskets and water bottles. The farm was part of a large corporate operation that supplied fruit to a major supermarket chain. The children were not on the payroll. Their parents were. The children would work until the sun became too hot, then they would be driven back. The same scene would repeat the next day and the day after until the harvest was over. No one stopped them. No one asked their age. No one wrote a report. The clock had not stopped. It was still ticking. On the morning of March 12, 2025, a federal investigator arrived at a poultry processing plant in Alabama. The plant was operated by a regional supplier that distributed chicken to fast food chains across the Southeast. The investigator had been sent after an anonymous tip. The tip claimed that children as young as 13 were working the night shift, cleaning equipment, when the regular staff had gone home. The investigator presented credentials at the front office. The plant manager denied the allegation. The investigator asked for a tour. The manager agreed, but only after a 20-minute delay. During that time, the investigator later determined at least 5 minors were told to hide in a walk-in cooler. The investigator walked through the processing floor. The air smelled of blood and bleach. Conveyor belts moved chicken parts in a steady rhythm. Workers in aprons and hairnets stood at stations, cutting, trimming, and packing. The investigator noticed that some workers looked very young, but did not have any identification visible. The plant manager insisted that all employees were over 18 and that documents had been checked. The investigator noted the number of workers on the floor and compared it to the payroll roster the company provided. There was a discrepancy. The roster listed 112 workers for that shift, but the investigator counted 112. The plant manager said the extra workers were temporary staff from a nearby agency. The agency records were not available that day. The investigator left with a promise to return. 2 weeks later, on March 27, 2025, a team of federal and state inspectors executed a surprise raid at the same plant. They arrived at 3:45 a.m., just as the night shift was ending. The plant was not expecting them. Inspectors found 14 minors working, the youngest being 12 years old. The children had been hired through a temp agency that operated out of a trailer in a neighboring county. The agency did not conduct background checks. It did not verify ages. It provided workers to the plant based on headcount, not names. The plant paid the agency in cash. The children were paid in cash as well, usually $7 an hour below the federal minimum wage. They worked from 10 at night until 5 in the morning, cleaning conveyor belts and defeathering machines. The machines were still running when they cleaned them. The children wore no protective gear. Their hands were raw from chlorine and detergent. What happened? The investigation expanded beyond the one plant. Over the next 4 months, the Department of Labor uncovered a network of temp agencies supplying underage workers to poultry plants across 3 states. The agencies operated in rural areas where poverty was high and unemployment was low. They recruited from immigrant communities. They promised parents that their children could earn money by working after school. They told parents that the work was safe and that the children would be supervised. None of that was true. The children were given false identification documents, often created by the agency. Some children were issued Social Security numbers that belonged to dead people. Others used the names of siblings who had already left the country. The agencies charged the parents a fee for each child placed, deducted from the child's wages. The children rarely saw any money. The parents received a lump sum that was less than what the agency was paid by the plant. The human cost was not abstract. A 14-year-old girl named Elena worked at the Alabama plant for 6 months before the raid. She had arrived from Guatemala with her mother in Tuzirat Wafer. Her mother worked in the same plant on the day shift. Elena had been placed on the night shift by the temp agency. She cleaned machines that were still running. In March 2025, one of the machines caught her hair. Her scalp was partially torn. She was treated at a local clinic, but the clinic did not report the injury because they did not ask her age. She continued working after 2 stitches. She did not want to lose the job. The family needed the income. Her mother earned $350 a week. Elena earned $140 a week. Combined, they could afford rent and food, but not much more. After the raid, Elena was interviewed by a social worker. She cried. She said she knew she was too young to work, but she did not know how else to survive. How could this have happened? The system that allowed Elena to work had many layers. The plant had been cited for safety violations in 2022 and 2023, but the fines were small and the company paid them without contest. The temp agency had no physical address on file with the state labor department. The state of Alabama had no specific law prohibiting the employment of minors in food processing. Federal law prohibited hazardous work for minors under 18, but the definition of hazardous work in poultry processing was not clear. The industry successfully argued that cleaning machines was not the same as operating them. The Department of Labor had proposed a rule in 2023 that would have classified all work on kill floors and processing lines as hazardous for minors. The rule was still under review. The poultry industry lobby spent over $3 million in 2024 opposing it. The enforcement system was also broken. The Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division had only 700 inspectors for the entire country. Each inspector was responsible for over 15,000 workplaces. The poultry industry alone had thousands of plants. The division prioritized cases involving unpaid wages over child labor because the penalties were higher. The average fine for employing a minor illegally was $15,000 per child. For a large plant, that was a cost of doing business. The plant in Alabama had been fined $120,000 after the raid. The company's annual revenue was estimated at $40 million. The fine was less than 1/3 of 1% of revenue. The company appealed the fine, and as of August 2025, the case was still pending. The children were not the only ones harmed. The parents faced legal consequences too. In some states, parents could be charged with allowing a child to work illegally. In Alabama, a law from 1995 allowed parents to be fined and even jailed if they permitted a child to work in a hazardous occupation. But the law was rarely enforced. The parents were often unaware of the law. They were also afraid of deportation. Many worked themselves without proper documentation. Reporting the temp agency or the plant would put their own jobs and families at risk. The system trapped them. They could not report the abuse without losing income and risking removal from the country. By June 2025, the Alabama case had become a national story. News outlets covered the raid extensively. Politicians from both parties expressed outrage. The Department of Labor announced a new task force on child labor in agriculture and food processing. The task force included representatives from the Justice Department, the Department of Health and Human Services, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement. But advocates pointed out that ICE participation could deter victims from coming forward. The task force held its first meeting in July 2025. It produced a report in September 2025 that recommended updating hazard definitions, increasing fines, and requiring temp agencies to register with the state. The report did not recommend closing the parental exemption. The task force concluded that the exemption was necessary for legitimate family farms. It did not address the fact that the exemption was widely abused by large subcontractors. The clock had not stopped. In October 2025, a 12-year-old boy named Marcos was working in a vegetable processing plant in Florida. He had been hired by a temp agency that shared an address with a hardware store. He worked 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. He cut celery. The knives were sharp and the pace was fast. He cut his left hand twice. Both times, a supervisor wrapped it in tape and sent him back to the line. The plant did not keep a first aid log. Marcos did not tell his mother because she would make him stop working. He needed the money to help pay for his sister's asthma medication. The medication cost $80 a month. Marcos earned $70 a week. On the evening of October 27, 2025, Marcos collapsed on the cutting line. He was dehydrated and exhausted. A coworker carried him to the break room. The plant manager did not call an ambulance. He told the coworker to give Marcos water and let him rest. Marcos rested for 30 minutes, then returned to the line. He worked until midnight. The next morning, he woke up with a fever. His mother took him to a clinic. The doctor diagnosed heat exhaustion and malnutrition. The clinic reported the case to the state child welfare agency. The agency visited the family but could not locate the temp agency. The agency had disappeared. The address was a vacant lot. The business had closed without leaving a forwarding address. The plant claimed it had no record of Marcos. The case was closed. Marcos returned to work a week later. He found a new job at a strawberry farm. No one checked his age. The system that allowed all of this was not a series of failures. It was a design. The laws contained intentional gaps. The exemptions for agriculture and small businesses were not accidents. They were written into the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938 because Southern lawmakers wanted to protect the plantation economy. Those exemptions had never been removed. The parental exemption allowed families to work together, but it also allowed contractors to avoid responsibility. The penalties were low because the lobbying power of agricultural and processing industries was high. The enforcement was weak because funding was controlled by a Congress that received campaign donations from those same industries. The result was a labor market where children were visible only when they were injured or caught. At 4:15 a.m. on November 18, 2025, a bus pulled into a migrant labor camp in Central Florida. It carried 50 workers, including at least 8 minors. The camp had no running water. The showers were broken. The toilets were overflowing. The workers lived in trailers designed for 4 people but housing 12. The children slept on floor mats. They woke before dawn, ate a piece of bread, and boarded another bus that took them to a tomato field. They worked until noon. Then they were bused back to the camp, given a meal of rice and beans, and told to rest. They worked again in the evening from 5 to 8, harvesting green beans. The children were paid piece rates. A bucket of beans paid 50 cents. A full day of work could earn $6. That was less than the cost of the food the company deducted from their pay. The farm was owned by a large corporation that sold to a major grocery chain. The chain had a policy requiring suppliers to follow all labor laws. The corporation had a similar policy, but the camp was operated by a subcontractor who was hired by another subcontractor who was hired by a crew leader. By the time the worker was on the field, the corporate parent could claim it had no knowledge. The crew leader did not keep official records. He paid cash. He provided no benefits. He did not report any injuries. The children were invisible. The chain's auditor visited the farm in 2024 and did not find the minors. The auditor spent 2 hours on site. The children were hidden in a bus during the visit. The audit satisfied the chain's requirements. The system of subcontracting created a web so dense that responsibility could not be assigned. The cost was borne by the children. A 15-year-old named Miguel had worked at the camp for 3 months in Tuziaratwafiv. He had developed chronic back pain from bending over in the fields. He had not seen a doctor. He had no health insurance. His mother was also working in the fields. She did not know he had pain. He did not tell her. He was afraid she would send him home to Honduras. He needed to send money to his grandmother who was raising his younger siblings. He sent $50 a week. That left him with $6 for himself. He bought snack food from the camp store run by the crew leader. The prices were double what they were at a regular store. Miguel was living on chips and soda. His teeth were rotting. He had not been to a dentist in his life. The cycle had no natural end. The children grew up if they survived. Some became adults who worked the same fields. Some became crew leaders themselves. Some escaped, but not many. The community that depended on their labor also depended on their silence. The churches, the schools, the clinics, all were underfunded and overburdened. The local economy ran on cheap labor. The children were not victims in the abstract. They were participants in a system that they could not control and could not leave. The system did not need to be cruel. It just needed to be efficient. And it was. On December 1, 2025, a federal judge in Florida dismissed a class action lawsuit filed on behalf of child farm workers. The lawsuit had been brought by a legal aid organization. It argued that the agricultural exemption from child labor laws violated the Constitution. The judge ruled that the exemption was a policy choice made by Congress, not a constitutional violation. The case was appealed. It would take years to reach a higher court. The children named in the lawsuit were no longer working. Some had been deported. Others had moved to different states. One had died in a car accident on the way to a field. The lawsuit lived on without them. At the end of December 2025, the Department of Labor released its annual enforcement report. It showed that child labor violations had increased by 23% over the previous year. The number of minors employed illegally was estimated at over 300,000 nationwide. The report noted that many of these children were not counted in official statistics because they worked in informal arrangements. The report recommended increased funding, but the budget for the next year had already been cut. The administration had proposed a 3% increase for labor enforcement. Congress had approved a 2% decrease. The report was filed. It was read by a few journalists, then it was forgotten. A child woke up early on a cold morning in January 2006. He was 8. He lived in a trailer without heat. He dressed in the dark. He ate a piece of bread. He walked a mile to a waiting truck. The truck took him to a field. He picked broccoli until his fingers bled. He did not complain. He did not know he had other options. He had been told that this was what children did. His father had done it. His older brother had done it. The land had not changed. The work had not changed. The only thing that had changed was the year on the calendar. It was not early America anymore. It was now.